This is the first time I've done an in-person recording with anybody outside of like the two people in my family and my house. So I'm feeling a little nervous, especially given the depths of the topic that we're going to cover, which is something that my listeners have been asking me for so many times, especially my self-lovers with chronic health conditions, those who have gone through very difficult things, not just related to body image, but like body experience health. And I know you have been through the ringer with that shit.
That's true. And before we go any farther, I just want you to know that because something that you just said was, it can feel heavy. And I want this episode to feel the most supportive way possible. And so that's my job, is to help it not feel heavy.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm going to try my best to do right now, so everyone can leave with the tools that they are hoping to find.
I think that's why I've been following you for 6 years, because not only are you a warrior, but like you said, you add a sense of levity to such darkness, and it makes it easier and digestible, and you're such like a warm and encouraging voice. I love your podcast and the relaunch of it. So I know that it's going to be that times 1,000 in this one.
You're so nice. Thank you. I'm honored to be here with you, so I'm excited for this.
Now that we're committed to lightness, let's talk about grief.
Perfect.
Tell me about your personal experience with grief and like why you started researching it, studying it, guiding other people through it, because you do it so beautifully. You're not one of those people that just talks about it from personal experience. You're also like very well educated on it.
Well, I will go back just 3 years ago, because I feel like 2020 was kind of this level ground for all of us, because all of us went through something during the pandemic, even if it was on a global scale, just the sense of normalcy that changed. 2020 for me was really difficult personally, because I was 16 weeks pregnant, and we had just moved into our new home that was our dream forever home to bring our baby boy into, and it was the same week that the pandemic shut everything down here in Arizona. I got really sick a couple days after moving in. Because everything had just shut down here in Arizona, I was nervous to go to the doctor. We were supposed to stay home. You know, we didn't know then what we know now.
You're pregnant.
I was pregnant. We were just trying to be safe. And so I kept holding out. And then that night, around midnight, the pain just escalated. And I was in my bed screaming. I was crying. I had a fever. I couldn't get out of bed. And so my husband called the ambulance, and they rushed me to the hospital. And when they got there, they checked the baby. The baby was fine. He's doing good. And I was like, okay, I can go through anything that I need to, because I can do this for the baby. They then found that I had gone septic, which at that time I had heard about it. I didn't really know the severity of it or what it meant, but basically it's when your body has an infection and then it enters your bloodstream. A large percentage of people who actually die in the hospital die from going septic, or they lose their limbs, or they go into kidney failure, or there's so many things that happen. I didn't realize the severity of going septic until they then said, we have to admit you for, we don't know how long, because you need to be watched and medicated. We need to make sure that we can get on top of this. But then they also said this is the first day that the hospital has started a policy that you can't have any outside guests be with you. So you need to say goodbye to your husband right now. I remember in that moment just feeling so freaking terrified, lonely, nervous. And because also it was during the pandemic, they didn't know where to put me because I was pregnant. And so they didn't want to expose me to any patients that they had. So they put me in a triage room. I was behind a little curtain for days. And there's this one part of my stay there where I thought I was going to die. And a nurse came running in, and she looked at me and she said, very soon there's going to be a rapid response team, is what it's called, of 8 doctors surrounding you so that we can get you stable again. And this man came up. His name was Willie. I'll never forget Willie. And he was taking an EKG of my heart to see what was going on because I was having a really hard time breathing. And I remember looking at Willie and I said, am I going to die right now? And he looked at me and he said, Ashley, you are the person who has been called to get through this moment. You're the only one who can pull yourself out of it. We're here to support you, but you have to find the strength in you right now to help get through to this other side. And that was the first and only time in my life where I realized that I was literally on this line of life and death. And in that moment, I was like, I want to live so badly. There's still so much that I want to do, that I hope to do, that the people that I want to spend time with. Somehow we made it through that time, but then I called the doctors back in after they had left because I was like, there's no way that my baby just survived that too. I just had this feeling, I was like, whatever just happened to me, both of us could not have survived that. And so they took me down to get an ultrasound a few hours later. And the second they pulled the ultrasound up on the screen, I knew that he was gone. There was no heartbeat. And I ended up delivering him. I was in labor all night, but I didn't really know that because it was my first pregnancy. And also because I was in so much pain leading up to that at that point, like, pain is just pain. Like, it was just overtaking my body. But I had been in labor all night and I didn't know it. And so the next morning I delivered him all by myself in the hospital. And it was one of the most horrific moments of my life.
You went through that all alone?
All alone, yeah. Without
the support of, like, husband or family?
I mean, they were supporting me from FaceTime or from calls or from, afar. In fact, that night before when we found out that we lost our baby boy, his name is Jace. And Jace actually means healer. But my mom and sister drove to the parking lot to FaceTime me at the hospital just so that we could be as close as we possibly could, but we couldn't be, there together. But from that and from the grief that entered into our life, from losing him, the pregnancy, through my grief of my body, through the guilt I felt, through the betrayal that I felt my body had brought me, to the grief that started to impact the marriage of me and my husband, because we're grieving differently. We're trying to figure things out. I mean, grief literally overtook every sense of our lives. And I knew I had to figure out a way to work through it. People wish that they would have allowed themselves to be happier. And I think about that often because I think that so many times in our lives, and specifically if I just think of my own and this specific example that I'm sharing right now, it was so easy for me, and I often fell in this pattern of, I'm going to be happy when I feel better. I'm going to be happy when I feel like me and my husband are on the same page. I'm going to be happy when I'm pregnant again. I'm going to be happy when my baby comes out. It's just, we wait for this train of happiness to come, trying to convince ourselves that that's what's going to save us. But what I have learned about healing is that it's not one big moment. It's consistent movement forward. And if we don't do the work that we need to invite healing into our lives, we will get those things, and we can get those things and feel more miserable than ever. And so healing has never been about that outcome, but it's about that feeling that we carry with us of wholeness, of allowing ourselves to return to ourselves, to trust ourselves, to allow ourselves to feel all of our emotions, whether they are hard or they are happy. And going back to what you said about a lot of people die alone, I think that in our aloneness is really when things are quiet, where if we haven't done that healing work, the pain can get really, really, really loud, which is why I think that so many people are afraid of dying alone.
So post that hospital stay, how did you crawl yourself out? How did it impact your marriage? I would love to hear about like the different types of grief, and like I think a lot of people are familiar with like the stages of grief, but in a deeper sense, like how do people grieve differently, and what was that like for you personally?
Yeah, so I literally crawled my way through. In the beginning, I couldn't get out of bed because my body had just gone through sepsis, and then for 6 weeks after that, I felt like my body was on fire, and I kept going to the doctors. We kept trying to figure things out. No one could figure it out. After 6 weeks, would you know that they finally listened to me, that something was severely wrong, and I had retained placenta for 6 weeks, which kills people. And then I had to have an emergency surgery to remove that. So my body, I felt so unsafe in my body during that time that I almost started dissociating from it because I didn't feel safe inside of it. I remember feeling so betrayed by my body, so mad at it, so frustrated that it saved me, but it didn't save my son. And I remember this very real feeling of wanting to run away from myself. That's the only way I know how to describe it. But I couldn't. I couldn't go anywhere. No matter where I went, there I was. But then that also impacted my relationship with my husband, because when you don't feel safe in yourself, or you feel this shame or this guilt with yourself, it's very hard to connect with another person, or very hard to feel safe connecting with another person. And a lot of times, men and women in a heterosexual relationship grieve differently. And this isn't 100% of the time, but research has shown us it happens very often where men want to move forward in their life. So a lot of times men will work more, or they'll take on more projects, or they're kind of leave more, or whatever that looks like. And women usually, categorically, again, not all the time, want to talk about it and need to talk about it. If your partner's also not talking about it, then we can start telling ourselves stories of, oh, this doesn't matter to you. Oh, this isn't as important to you. Or how could you move on so fast? And then that can create a lot of friction. And so we're trying to navigate just so many things that we were grieving, and we were still in a pandemic. So we didn't have a lot of outside support, and community is so vital. And I just remember being like, I cannot feel this way the rest of my life. What do I need to do to help things move from where I am right now to hopefully one day feeling just a little bit better than this?
What were those things? Because I'm listening to you as somebody who's a longtime follower, a longtime admirer. My husband knows you by first name. Like,
So
we watch you guys and look up to you. You and Mike are so like emotionally intelligent and self-aware. And how long have you been married?
Crap. I'm like, wait, why don't I know this off the top of my head? It's
Like-
either 13 or 14 years.
Okay, like over a decade. That's what I thought.
I think it's 14.
Wow,
That's wild.
a long time.
Yeah.
That's a long time. I listened to your story and I'm like, if they struggled, which I find hard to believe, just again listening to you and learning from you, but also knowing that there's so much that goes on. How can we crawl out? Like, what were those things that helped you, especially amidst a pandemic where that vital part of community was taken from us?
There's one thing that I wish everyone would do. When I tell you what this one thing is about how can we start moving forward in our grief, you're going to be like, okay, that does not sound profound at all. But truly, we spend our lives avoiding this. And so then we just find ourselves cycling back over and over again into this pain that hurts us. But the number one place we need to start is with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the first step of helping our grief move through us. Well, what does that mean? Because we actually live in a society that is anti that. That in the workplace, this is so wild. The bereavement policy, on average, if you lose someone who is very close to you, an immediate family member, if they pass away, you get 3 days off of work. And then you are expected to show up, produce as normal, work work as well as you were before. That's just how our society is. We're told to shove things down, or to lose more weight if we want to feel better, or to take this pill, or to whatever, buy this thing. We're told to do literally everything but acknowledge the pain, because sometimes it feels easier just to pretend that you're okay or to focus on other things. But with acknowledgement, it's really being able to witness your pain and take a check of where you are and why you are feeling that way, so that then you can have help finding the language and the steps that you need to take to move forward. But until you can reach that point where you acknowledge that you're actually not doing okay, you're going to keep running in these very hazardous cycles, doing things that don't help you. Some people spend their whole life doing that.
What does acknowledgement look like? I think a lot of people listening are pretty good at validating other people's feelings. They're like, yeah, that's hard. I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to let you be in your pain. And then we struggle to do that for ourselves. Like, what did that look like for you and Mike? Did you have a moment of realization that you maybe glossed over it without acknowledging it? Or like, how did you know what to do?
During that time, I was finishing writing my book. And
which one?
I Am Here.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to focus on my book to create a best-selling book. I'm going to throw all of my energy in this. That was one of the most harmful things that I could have ever done for myself. Instead of paying attention to the parts of me that needed help, I threw myself into work. Part of what is so hard about acknowledging is that also in the grief process, we feel something called guilt. And guilt can be the biggest source of just our demise. We tell ourselves that it was our fault. We tell ourselves that if we would have done something differently, then we wouldn't have the outcome that we have had. But what we know about guilt, and the reason why we feel it in the grieving process, is because guilt is this trick that our mind plays on us that tells us that we're in control, and that if we just do something differently in the future, then we're going to be living in this safe and predictable world. So guilt is really trying to protect us to feel safe, but instead it tells us these lies. And so for me, getting to this place where I really was able to confront my guilt and acknowledge it for what it was, and acknowledge the reality that life is just really hard sometimes. And as much as I love to be in control, because I sure do, that I can't always be in control, and there's going to be hard things happening. So then how can I support myself to feel safe in an unpredictable world? And that led me to then the next steps of what does our marriage look like in a world that is unpredictable? How do we feel safe together? What types of things do I need to add into my routine so that I feel safe throughout my day? Do I need meditation so that I feel like I'm trusting my gut and listening to myself more? What type of foods am I feeding my body to help facilitate this healing process? There's just so many different little things that I started adding in. I actually created myself a healing ritual. Because I do like control so much, and I have a really hard time when I'm out of control.
Big sister vibes.
It's really, oldest daughter.
Yep.
I actually wrote out a healing schedule for myself. And starting with 8 a.m., what was I doing? 9 a.m., 10:30. I needed a structure so that instead of trying to numb, because the opposite of acknowledgement is numbing. Instead of trying to numb and shove things into my body or just trying to zone out by doing things that weren't actually helping me, I had to get very intentional with how I was spending my time so that I could feel better in the long run.
I don't know if this analogy will land, but it almost reminds me of how when somebody is in the thick of recovery, like say they're doing an inpatient eating disorder treatment program, the people, as far as I know, the medical professionals will make a meal plan for you to ensure that you are eating. Now, when you're out of recovery, you might think that this is, rigid. It's the opposite of what should happen in healing with, food freedom and everything. But when you are that deep, structure creates like a sense of stability, and like you mentioned, that safety element, trying to not employ as much willpower, but having it like in your schedule, like from 12 to 1 I shall cry.
Yes.
Because that part is important. For some reason it made me think of that.
Totally. Well, and it helps give a sense of predictability.
Mm-hmm.
You know what to expect in a situation where you feel so out of control, and in a world that is so unpredictable. Having a schedule like that brings a sense of predictability that allows you to start feeling a little bit safer, because you know what is coming up next.
Mm-hmm. I love that you brought up guilt as like a mean cousin of grief. A certain family member went through like a really hard health crisis. I remember them expressing a lot of like the guilt of feeling like, I'm putting my family through this. I'm taking away from their lives. Did you ever feel that way with Mike or your family?
100%. I felt so guilty, especially with Mike, that I didn't protect his son. With my family, that they were going through the pain of losing their grandson or their nephew, and also the fear that they had of losing me. I honestly, to be totally honest, I still feel that guilt, because we, happy news, we do have a 17-month-old little girl now. And I know that my husband, Mike, wants more kids. I know that. And I also know that I physically and emotionally can't go through that again. And so we've had so many conversations about that she's our baby, she's here, and I cannot go through being pregnant again. And I carry that guilt also. I carry the guilt of knowing we would love more children and not being able to give that to him, to us, to her, my daughter. And so, there's two ways that we feel guilt. Sometimes guilt comes because we know that we've made a mistake somewhere along the way, and it helps us course correct, or it helps us apologize, it helps us change our pattern. But in grief, it tries to help us feel like we're in control, and that we're the ones to blame. And so living in that place of self-blame, though, that's actually what damages our relationships with the people that we are hurting for.
We're sitting here in person, and driving here to you, I was getting flashbacks, because the last time that I was on this side of town was exactly 11 months ago. It was a couple days after me and my husband took our engagement photos, and my best friend, who's also a very talented photographer, was the one who took our engagement photos. And she brought her best friend, also her roommate that she's had through all of COVID, and somebody that, we were always mutual friends with because we hung out together. And she brought her friend to like film some videos of Stan and I during our engagement session, and it was so fun. And then we went out for dinner and drinks later, and I get a phone call the day after that Katie died last night. I came on this side of town because this happened to be where my friend was staying and where I picked her up from, after she found out the news that her best friend of many, many years tragically suddenly passed away in the middle of the night because she was trying to do the safe thing and take a Uber home, but instead that Uber crashed and killed her. And it was insane, like receiving that news and watching my friend grieve so much more, because she was a lot closer to her, and then still thinking about her and hearing her voice and all of our engagement, and so many of our happy memories, and having that photo album on our coffee table, and like always knowing that like Katie was behind that camera too. And the reason why I bring this up is because even like kind of having this, I know you as a grief expert, you're going to be like, this is wrong, Mary. You are entitled to your grief too. I almost felt like I was getting like secondhand grief because I was like trying to support a friend and I wasn't as close to Katie. So I remember like just feeling like guilty in other like family drama that we've had to deal with and tragic stuff that my husband and I have been going through over the past year. There's this sense of, like you said, the illusion of control. Like if only I had driven Katie home, if only she had waited 5 minutes, and I remember literally I have a text from her 15 minutes before she died because she replied to some dumb meme I sent her on Instagram. And I was thinking like, if only like I had texted her back on Instagram, then maybe she wouldn't have gotten into the Uber at the exact time that she did. And then that all led to her death. All that to say that close, mean cousin of grief being guilt is like something that rings so true and like so deeply. I just love the way that you presented it as an illusion of control, of thinking that like we could have changed it if only we had done the littlest thing.
First of all, I'm so sorry. Yeah. And I think that something that you said right now is a very common feeling that all of us share in grief with that guilt. But then also what I heard you say is that you felt guilty for grieving when you knew that she was closer to your friend. Something that we all do, and this is why I brought up acknowledgement as the very first thing, is that we always tell ourselves stories of why we don't have permission to feel how we do. Of other people have it worse than us, or this is my fault, so I shouldn't be grieving, I should just berate myself, or whatever that is. It's just this consistent story of, well, I don't have it as bad as them, therefore my feelings shouldn't be this way and they're not valid. But the truth is that grief comes when you lose someone, when you lose anything. It doesn't even have to be a death that brings grief. There's so many different parts of life that bring it, but until we're able to sit and acknowledge and allow ourselves to feel it, it can make moving through it feel really difficult, because grief is hard enough as it is. Even if you're accepting it and I'm acknowledging it, and okay, I'm talking through my guilt and I have support and I have therapy and I have all these things, the best case scenario is that your grief is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Part of healing is not how do we not feel this feeling anymore, because what we also know about grief is that it changes you, and when you lose someone or something that you love, that's going to last for the rest of your life. That is just the reality of it. So it's not how do I stop feeling this way, it's how can I also feel joy again too. How can I feel safe again too? How can I dream again too? How can I live in a way that honors the past while also honors the future? And that's the goal of a place that I hope all of us can get to in our grief with the right tools.
Oh my God, that was so good. I want to respect your time. Do you have time for two questions?
Yeah.
2 more questions. You mentioned, well, first I want to highlight that, like you said, grief doesn't have to be from like a loss or a tragic event. We talked on your podcast, which is also out, about grieving a life unlived, which is what I can imagine a lot of what you were feeling after your pregnancy lost.
We were talking about lost a lot.
We were talking about that on your show. So could you highlight if there are any other scenarios or situations that can bring up grief for people? I know we talked a bit about that feeling of your body betraying you, of the life that you had to leave behind against your own will. There's, heartbreak. There's obviously deaths. What else?
There's so many things. Losing a job. If you're in a place where your coworkers mean everything to you, and you got fired or you had to quit, and now your identity, even if you didn't like your job, you still found identity in that job. And now you're like, who am I without this? How do I rebuild? There's loss of dreams for the future, whether that's because of an illness or a medical condition or a diagnosis, or plans just changed, or a breakup happened. There's grief that comes through a divorce. There's, oh my gosh, something that so many women struggle with, and we're like, am I the only one? Why do I feel this terrible? Is friendship breakups. When that person's still there out in the world, but it's called an ambiguous loss, because there's no closure, but you don't share that same connection anymore, and you wish you did, maybe. A lot of grief comes from that. There can be grief postpartum. You have your baby who you've wanted and you love, and also you miss who you were before your baby came, and you're trying to figure that out. There can be grief of watching your parents age, or I mean, there's just so many ways. Grief of a pet, right? A pet who dies, like so many things that deeply impact us, but that a lot of times we don't give permission for us to process through, because again, we tell ourselves, well, it's not as bad, so I should be feeling like this. But the reality is that anytime you experience a loss, it's going to impact you, because who you are now after that loss is different than who you were before. And that in itself is also a grief.
What did you call it? Ambiguous
loss.
Ambiguous loss. That similar to friendship breakups, I think of like my estranged family.
Yes.
Which is like a way of grief. But like I shared on your podcast, my complicated feelings about my dad. One complicated feeling that I'm currently having is that I haven't spoken to him in years. So it's like he's like dead, but I don't know if he's dead. He could be dead. And then a dark part of me is like, it would just be easier if he was dead, because then I could have, like you said, closure. So that brings me to, how do you feel about, how people say time heals? Because I'm sure people who are dealing with, like, for example, a chronic health condition, and they're like, there's no end in sight, or an estranged family, like there is, like, what is the end? The only end is more grief. So I have a feeling that it's just something we have to learn how to coexist with, like you said, with like, how do I move forward to? How do you feel about time heals?
So first of all, I hate the phrase time heals all wounds. There's a lot of things. I also hate everything happens for a reason.
Oh.
I also hate God has a better plan. I also hate they were needed on the other side. There's a lot of things that we say to ourselves and to each other to try to make the situation feel better. But the reality is that your grief is as bad as it feels. And sometimes we have to sit with that. Now, to help us move forward, another thing about grief is that grief is not something that we move on from, but it's something that we can move forward with. The thing about grief that we are taught wrong is that grief is something that must be fixed. But if grief was something that must be fixed, then that would mean that we are broken. And we're not broken. Instead of grief being something to be fixed, what I have learned about grief, not just personally, but also through research and study in school, is that grief is something to be experienced. And as we can invite tools in to help us experience our grief in a way that feels supportive, in a way that gives us the tools and the language and the rituals to help us keep walking forward, then grief can feel like something that's not so heavy and scary, but something that we coexist with that was never made to destroy us. But because we are human and because we are surrounded by love, of course we're going to feel it. That is what connects us in this human experience.
Your daughter is so fucking lucky. She's so lucky, and your husband's so lucky, and I'm so lucky to know you.
You're so
I can't handle this.
Thank you.
I love you, Ashley. I've been trying to practice not throwing out like I love you to random people I meet, but this is
I love
an
you
exception.
back.
I love you. Thank you so much for serving us today.
Thank you for letting me be here with you.